Hi, everyone. Our webinar, A Closer Look with OGR, Biden's Asylum Rule, will start shortly. Just want to give everyone enough time to that's in the waiting room to get in. We'll go over a few housekeeping notes before we get started into the substance of the rule, the reason we're here today. This is a meeting format and all participants will be on mute. We reserve the right to remove anyone should you be disruptive, rude, or unkind. Spanish interpretation is available using the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. Se puede escuchar en español, por favor, usa el botón abajo que se llama interpretation. We also have automatic closed captions available for those who would like. You can use the CC button, show captions button below as well. This will go quick, but the slides and the recording will be sent around to all who have registered, and you are welcome to share this with anyone unable to attend today. There will likely be time for a short question and answer portion at the end. So please, as you are able, use the Q&A button instead of the chat so we can ensure to see your question. Sometimes the chat gets full. So if you could use the Q&A button as you are able. All right, so we'll get started. Hello, everyone. I'm Lindsay Warburton. I'm the Immigration Policy Advisor for the Episcopal Church's Office of Government Relations, or OGR. OGR's mission is to represent the policy priorities of the Episcopal Church to the U.S. government in Washington, D.C. All of our priorities are given to us through the resolutions of General Convention and Executive Council, which are the legislative and governing bodies of the Church. OGR also manages the Episcopal Public Policy Network, which I imagine many of you are familiar with or are part of. If you're not, please consider joining. The EPPN is our primary means of educating, equipping, and engaging Episcopalians in the ministry of public policy advocacy. So that's just a little overview of who we are and why we're here today giving this presentation. Now, the topic of today's conversation is the Biden administration's proposed rule called Circumvention of Legal Pathways. This rule was proposed last week on February 23rd to help mitigate the anticipated increase of arrivals at our southern border, potentially after we lift the Title 42 public health order in May. Under this rule, any migrant who attempts to enter the country at our southwest border and only at our southwest border without valid documents will be assumed ineligible for asylum if they, one, do not enter the country, quote unquote, lawfully. I'll explain what lawfully means shortly under this rule. Or two, if they do not ask for protection in a country through which they travel on their way to the United States. Now, under this rule, what does it mean to enter lawfully so that you can seek asylum as a non-citizen? There are a few limited ways which I'll outline here, and I'll also talk about some of the ways these are problematic. So the first way you can enter into the US is through one of the new humanitarian parole programs that the Biden administration created. It has a number of requirements, including filling out an application, having a US-based sponsor, obtaining a passport, and arriving via plane. And as you can probably tell, that's a long list of requirements. And this is not practical nor possible for many, many migrants, especially migrants fleeing persecution. Additionally, this program is limited to citizens of Cuba, Venezuela, Haiti, and Nicaragua. So we'll leave out the vast majority of migrants arriving at our border. All right, so if you don't qualify under the parole program, you can schedule an appointment ahead of time to show up at a port of entry through the newly created CBP1 phone application. However, there are numerous bugs and issues with this app. Overuse of this app means appointments are used up or they dry up almost instantly. And it's very hard to get appointments together as a family because of how quickly the appointments go up. It requires migrants to have access to a smartphone and sufficient signal, Wi-Fi, and digital literacy in order to use it. And it's still not available in all languages. As if this isn't reason enough to rely on this application, as the rule desires and proposes, asylum under US law is not contingent upon entering at a port of entry. I'll go into more detail later, but wanted to highlight that now. So finally, the third option, if you are unable to do any of the first two, you may cross only after you have been rejected for asylum by a country through which you traveled on the way to the United States. Again, this is problematic, not just because it's illegal, but it's especially harmful for people who are particularly vulnerable to persecution or discrimination in countries they transit through, like LGBTQ, Black, and disabled asylum seekers, to name a few. Now, as you saw in the previous slides, there are a small number of exemptions or exceptions under this rule. For one, unaccompanied minors are not subject to this rule. And then there are also a number of narrow exceptions, including for victims of a severe form of trafficking, having an acute medical emergency, or being under imminent severe threat to their life or safety. So to recap, unless you fall under these three narrow categories that I just named, or are an unaccompanied minor, and you have followed the rules process, you are presumed ineligible for asylum, regardless of whether you have a valid claim. So as you can see, that's quite restrictive to how you can ask for asylum. I do want to bring up that there are two alternative forms of relief under this rule that the United States is still required to screen for, called withholding of removal or convention against torture. And I bring this up only because the Biden administration would like to say this is not a ban on asylum because of some of these exceptions or alternatives. But I do want to emphasize that the criteria to get relief under these two policies are much stricter than a typical asylum claim, and the benefits are also much more limited. Under these two policies, for example, there's no pathway to citizenship like there is for asylum, and there's no right to petition a family member later. So these are really not great alternatives for having the basic right to asylum. Again, as you can see, there's a real danger of rejecting someone with a legitimate case for asylum simply because they do not follow a certain pathway to get here. And as I've alluded to before in this presentation, this violates both domestic law and international law. This is also why when Trump tried to enact similar policies in 2020, they were stopped by the courts. But I just want to highlight some of the laws that I'm referring to here, because we often hear this policy is illegal, but want to highlight for you specifically why it's illegal. On the one hand, our US asylum law says that any person, regardless of whether they enter at a port of entry and irrespective of their status, may apply for asylum. That is part of our law. The US has signed on to international treaties that obligate us not to return any person back to a country where they will face persecution or torture. which will almost certainly happen under this rule. So again, who is this going to impact? Because this proposed rule only applies to the southwest border, not our northern border, not for people who come via plane, this will primarily impact Black, Brown, and Indigenous asylum seekers who make up the majority of encounters at our border and who might not be able to afford or get easy access to a visa to arrive via plane. So I put this chart here to show the percentage of people who arrive at our border. In January, over 70% were from our Western hemisphere. Additionally, we anticipate this will impact LGBTQ plus pregnant and disabled asylum seekers because of the limited number of exceptions. This will impact families as well because of the limited number of exceptions. For example, as a trans person, it is highly likely that it's not safe for you to ask for asylum in a country on the way, or to have to wait weeks for an appointment on the phone application in Mexico. But that person would not be exempt under this rule. So how can you help? I've just given you a crash course into the rule. And again, I'll be accepting questions at the end. But the reason we're having this presentation today is so that hopefully you'll be inspired to take some action. So you can help by submitting a comment for the public record using the link on the screen, and we'll also put it in the chat. You can submit online an original comment opposing this rule. This is a 30-day comment period. Usually for rules and regulations by presidential administrations, it's 60 days, but this is 30 days. And all comments are due by Monday, March 27th. Another technical note, all comments must be submitted in English or come with an English translation. But you can submit regardless of your immigration status. All comments will be public, so please keep that in mind. Your comment will be online attached to your name. But importantly, DOJ and DHS, the two agencies who publish this rule, will be required to read all submitted comments and take them into consideration in finalizing the rule. So let's get into some tips for writing your comment. One of the most important things for writing your comment and submitting it is writing it in your own words. If your comment appears to be the same as others, they will lump them together as one comment instead of individual comments, which can kind of hurt the process a little bit in terms of figuring out what the actual response is. However, if you do want to submit a comment with your church or with your organization, you can do that as well. Of course, making sure you have permission from your church or organization to do that on their behalf. With that being said, it can be difficult to come up with something out of nowhere if this isn't your area of expertise. We suggest you use the talking points, which I'll discuss on the next slide, but you can also reference the policies of the Episcopal Churches, General Convention, and Executive Council. And you can use other relevant facts and research to guide your comments. Finally, we recommend you offer information on your areas of expertise, your educational or professional background, and your involvement with immigration issues. Whether you do or don't have a direct connection with immigration issues, though, we always recommend stating your expression of faith and how that influences your position. So many of you who take action with us every week with our action alerts on a number of issues say, we always put in the message, as an Episcopalian and your constituent. So we recommend you can say, as an Episcopalian, as an Episcopal priest, as a member of this church, you're welcome to say that. And if you are directly involved with immigrants, please keep in mind the privacy of others. If you share personal stories of those ministries, we want to be sure that we're respecting people's privacy as well. So some of the talking points, we've already discussed many of them today. So these are just other examples put into phrases that you could use. But again, we just talked about some of these points. This proposed rule is in violation of US and international law. It puts families and other vulnerable migrants in further danger. We just talked about how increasing some legal pathways like parole and CBP1 cannot be a substitute for having basic access to asylum, right? People who cannot access the CBP1 app are at serious risk of being turned away. You know, we don't want to have to force people to seek asylum and transit to the United States because migrants may face harm. And finally, you can say general things to demonstrate the moral and humanitarian impacts of the proposed rule. I'm concerned as a person of faith and as an American as well. I want to provide for you here some sample comments to kind of give you an idea that anyone can write a comment, expert or not. I've actually pulled some real life examples from folks who wrote comments opposing Trump's asylum rule in 2020. So I'll share a few now here. So this person says, I'm a member of this Episcopal church in this city and state. I oppose the proposed rule as a person of faith and as an American, right? This person also goes into their history a little bit and why they support bringing immigrants to the United States and how this rule would be contrary to that. Another example, this is from an Episcopal church. So this Episcopal church opposes the Trump administration's asylum rule. And then they go into more detail about what they oppose about the rule. We believe this rule attempts to curtail our nation's longstanding commitment, right? It's contrary to our understanding of the gospel, which is to practice acts of caring. So again, we had an individual comment and an Episcopal church comment. This person says they use up they reference being part of the Episcopal church. They reference their role in helping pass some resolutions through the General Convention. They reference their history as an immigration lawyer and on the board of an organization that helps migrants, and connects all of that work into why they oppose the rule as well. So that's just a number of ways. Again, these slides will be made available, so you're able to review them a little closer. This is for the 2020 asylum rule, which differs from this rule, but you can also get an understanding of what that might look like. And in case you're wondering, I wasn't paraphrasing. That's the full comment. So some of these are 3 or 4 sentences, a paragraph to explain why we oppose it as well. And that's really all that's required of you as well. Some of the resources that are going to be in the follow-up email I'm going to include a fact sheet on the asylum rule. It's a little bit technical, but in case that's of interest to you, a summary of the Episcopal Church policy on immigration and refugee issues, which will put those policies right at your fingertips in case you'd like a little bit of guidance to what the church has already said. And also, if you prefer to see all of this in writing, the Office of Government Relations released an alert online that has the tips for writing a comment, more about the rule, and the link to submit it if you prefer to see that in writing. And then, of course, if you haven't already, if you're not on our list, please join our lists. We do calls like this often, as well as send out weekly messages on a variety of topics that impact immigrants and immigrant communities. We write on healthcare, housing, international issues as well, and would love to see you join today. So feel free to go to our link. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if there are any questions in the chat. And I look forward to kind of having this discussion with you all. So I'm going to take a second. Do we know if, I'm just going to kind of go in order as I see them. Do we know if the State Department is beefing up their consular divisions at embassies and offices to mitigate the effects of this policy? As the policy stands right now, that is not part of the policy that I'm aware of. Now that would be a good thing to maybe comment in the rule and say, have you all considered this as a potential impact? You know, I know that we've worked on funding asylum systems in Mexico and Costa Rica and Panama, but it can be quite limited, right? And they're still not at the capacity that would be needed in order to absorb all of these folks coming through. This question is about, do we know how long it takes to get an asylum decision in Central American countries? In the US, it takes 1 to 2 years. Actually, I would counter that it can take 4 to 7 years, considering the current backlogs to get that decision. Yeah, so I'm not 100% sure about the positions. I do believe it takes a decent amount of time. They don't have quite the same amount of systems and resources. So, and even with those resources, Mexico, for example, received something like over 100,000 applications, and it's just something they're not prepared for. And what I'm more concerned about is not having the resources to fully process these claims, and might result in you know, unfair denials. And again, it's not the safest place for people to be seeking asylum as well. Has there been any change to the categories for asylum, specifically domestic abuse and gang threat or violence? No, there has not been any expansion in the definition of asylum to include domestic violence or gang violence. Unfortunately, this rule is going in the opposite direction and is trying to restrict the access to asylum to very specific legal pathways. And yes, I can share the names of the 1951 Refugee Convention, and there's also one from the 60s. I'm happy to share that in the chat once I get through these questions. So what should a person who is seeking asylum submit as acceptable proof that they are under an imminent severe threat to their safety? That's a great question. And something under this rule is there's a requirement for something called a preponderance of evidence, right? So that's a pretty strict requirement for what they should prove. I don't think we know necessarily yet, until the rule is going to be implemented, what that might look like, how to prove that, you know, do you have to show up with can you show up with a text message from a smuggler, or do you have to show up with a gunshot in your stomach in order to be proven? We don't quite know what that will look like in practice. So unfortunately, I can't quite answer that, but you have to provide, you do have to provide proof and evidence, which is part of the issue with having this exception as well. Again, a similar question: what is a non-extreme form of human trafficking? Well, you know, I'm not going to really attempt to answer that necessarily. But again, you know, we saw human trafficking in the form of migrants in the back of a van in San Antonio, where their life was in incredible danger. Versus, you know, so I'm not entirely sure how they're going to define a difference between severe and non-severe human trafficking. The countries that are in the parole program, I'll emphasize again, are Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Haiti. Did I say that? Haiti, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. Great. Do asylum seekers have rights to equal protection? Yes. There's some limited protections for due process in our Constitution, under the 14th Amendment, but it tends not to be followed uniformly, and it doesn't guarantee, as we can see by even proposing rules like this, it's not a great guarantee of that things will be followed through, right? You're allowed to have a lawyer when you're going through immigration proceedings, but you're not entitled to a government funded counsel, right? So those are some examples where the discrepancies are, and it's quite hard to sue for those kinds of things. Great, I'm loving these questions. I'm trying to get through them, and so I apologize if I don't quite get to yours, but I'm doing my best. Do we have cases where comments have actually led to withdrawal of proposed rules? That's a really interesting question. And I'm not aware of examples where they've withdrawn a rule, but there have been cases where they've made good modifications, right? Reasonable modifications that have listened to some of them. I don't have any off the top of my head, but that's a good point. We support rescinding the rule in its entirety, right? But keeping in mind too that blanket opposition, while is one strategy, trying to make the rule as safe as possible is also another strategy as well. But I'm not aware of any examples recently where we've seen the withdrawal of a proposed rule. The best that we've seen is these rules get stopped in courts, which we're anticipating litigation as well. How do you anticipate this rule might also affect people currently in this country awaiting their asylum hearing? It's supposed to only affect people arriving to the southwest border, and we already have the significant backlog. So some of the Biden administration's rationale is that it'll lessen the burden on the backlog, but because we already have years-long wait, unless we put resources into that, I don't anticipate this rule is going to affect positively or negatively the status of people who are waiting for asylum. Has anyone articulated this discrimination inherent in this being only at the southern border? Absolutely. So if you're a person from a country that has a better visa system, you're fleeing persecution, like you're maybe from Russia or Europe, and you're facing discrimination, and you have better access versus countries that have a historic discrimination with the visa processing system. Yeah, absolutely. Right? If you can get here via plane, you can still apply for asylum. Why is it only the southwest border? And that's why I put that graphic on the slide there to show just how much of our arrivals at the southern border are from the Western Hemisphere, and how this would primarily and directly impact those populations as well. So part of what the Biden administration has done is created these parole programs so people can start flying here. But as I mentioned, it's limited to a small number of countries. And again, it requires resources and assets that not all asylum seekers have. For example, if you're being persecuted by your government, it might be quite hard to get a passport from that same government, right? And to be able to arrive here. What is the definition of the southwest border? Where's the dividing line? When we talk about the southwest border, we're talking about from California all the way to South Texas. I don't think Florida actually technically counts as our southwest border, but that's what I'm talking, the US-Mexico border as well. Great. Oh, great. Then the questions are disappearing. I see as I answer them. Thank you, Susie. How are those who meet one of the exceptions able to name that in order to get help? So people are still able to present themselves between or at ports of entry. And supposedly they'll be able to, present what evidence they have. Like they'll claim, if they're having an acute medical emergency, I imagine that would be fairly obvious. If they're under, you know, imminent threat of safety, again, I'm not 100% sure, and that's not incredibly clear how those exemptions will be processed and used. So I'm not an immigration lawyer or an expert, but that's, you know, my understanding of how that might work. And we're at time right now. I'm going to keep answering questions for those who want to stay on, because I think I'm loving the questions and I'm really valuing it. And I hope that this will help inform your understanding for submitting a comment or some other things. I understand we have some questions in the chat. Susie, should I go to the chat now, or let me look. I do want to answer this question though. Are citizens of the parole countries excluded in this rule? No. If you are a Nicaraguan who does not schedule an appointment through CBP-1 and did not, you know, apply for asylum, and you arrive at in another country and you arrive at our southwest border, you are not exempted under this rule. You have to arrive in one of the narrow pathways. But yes, those countries do have an advantage in having the parole program that other countries like Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador do not. They have an extra pathway, so to speak, beyond CBP-1. Yeah, Susie, is there anything that I'm missing? Could a talking point to be recommend increasing the number of immigration judges and overall staff so that more asylum claims can be adjudicated faster? Yeah, so I think, yes, as long as you're making clear that this needs to be instead of the rule. I mean, the public comment process it tends to be pretty specific to the rule itself. So we recommend keeping your recommendations to the rule, you know, because it's so specific, and you know, advocating to your members of Congress and the Biden administration directly to talk about alternatives to that. So yes, that is a better policy, but keeping in mind that when you submit comments, addressing specific parts of the rule can be particularly important. And of course, you're welcome to say what you would prefer instead, but keeping in mind that it probably won't be enacted as part of the rule necessarily, as well. Okay, Susie, is there anything that I have missed that you'd like to raise? Otherwise, I'll give folks back their time. Again, this will be recorded. This is recorded. The slides will be available. We'll send a follow-up email with resources. Please share. Looking forward to seeing all your comments online. And thank you all for being so interested in this work. And thank you so much.